Up next, ladies and gentlemen, the topic is Beyond the Buzzwords, the Authentic Procurement Challenge. And for the same, I would like to introduce the speaker, Mr. Gaurav Guha, Director of Enterprise Business at Procol, is an accomplished professional with extensive experience in sales, business development, and operations. His expertise includes sales optimization, solution consulting, and strategic sales intervention. He excels in procurement and supply chain automation and is known for his proficiency in RFP writing and marketing and business development. He has held leadership roles in various industries, leading companies. Please welcome Mr. Gaurav Guha, Director of Presales at Procol.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible. Perfect. Just a quick mic check. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Gaurav Guha. I'm the head of pre-sales for Procol. And today I wanted to focus on one of the most interesting topics, which are procurement buzzwords. Now, these are all catch-all terms which each and every one of you have come across. And I'm sure you've heard some of these. Do I have some sort of a slide thingy? I'm sure you've heard some of these buzzwords before. So show of hands, how many of you have heard of these terms before? Could you have suggestions for any more that you've come across that I haven't included here? Please, audience, anyone. Any other terms that you've come across? Well, if there are no suggestions, you can just start with this as a baseline. So you've heard of terms like blockchain, ESG, predictive analytics, procurement 4.0, where, just to clarify, this is where Internet of Things has been incorporated into the procurement and supply chain. You've got ChatGPT, generative AI, all various procure tech options, AI, ML, SPM, SRM, autonomous sourcing, tailspend management. Now, how many of you actually believe that these terms are applicable to the procurement context in India at the level of maturity that we are today? No, right? So these are nice, interesting concepts that we like to read about. We read articles about it, we hear American and US companies making great strides in these areas, but we know practically these are not possible in India today because the infrastructure simply does not exist. The maturity level does not exist. And this is true for pretty much the vast majority of companies outside of that maybe 0.1 or 0.2% of the largest enterprise companies. And also these companies have usually developed it as some sort of a global mandate, which they have successfully deployed in India. Again, successfully is a variable term because this happens to various degrees of success, usually low success. So going ahead, if we get past these keywords, we need to do a first principles approach to actually look into what are the core realities of the procurement scenario in Indian procurement, and to figure out what a feasible roadmap is to really get to global standards of best practices when it comes to these kind of terms. Because who wouldn't want to do predictive analytics? Who wouldn't want a procurement or supply chain where every aspect or every delivery can be tracked through an IoT type situation? Who wouldn't want autonomous sourcing to take care of all of your tailspend management needs, right? You don't have to assign those 10 resources managing thousands of line items for a small percentage of your spend, but you're still putting in that effort to actually execute that. We want to get to this level. So what my presentation here today is focused on is how to get from where we are today to global standards where we can actually discuss this in a practical way. We should be having a session where we should be talking about, yes, I use AI ML in this context, and it was successful. Not just about what it could possibly be used for, or what some foreign companies have used it for, which again has no connection to what we are doing today. So to get to the bottom of this, let's understand the core challenges in the procurement reality in Indian procurement across these key focus areas. So I'm sure you've realized that I've left out one part, which is post-PO or the AP part of it. And the reason I've done that is at least that, to a high degree, has been automated across the board through ERP systems. But the upstream side of it, the spend analysis, the sourcing, the contract management, the intake process, supplier management, this has different definitions and levels of maturity across every company here. So let's go into the depths of spend analysis. One second. Perfect. Now, when it comes to spend analysis in India, most companies don't do it because they simply can't do it. Or they do it with limited scope, limited categories, because getting a consolidated enterprise-wide coverage of your or visibility into your total spending is impossible with the current data quality. How many of you agree? Because the data simply does not exist in the format, in the clean format that we need it. The term garbage in, garbage out is pretty relevant over here. Now, for spend analysis, most of us are always playing a catch-up game. Because as we are trying to get control of spend, maybe trying to do a quarterly, half-yearly, or even an annual refresh, the uncategorized spend is still piling up. Because when we are creating spend data, we are creating it in an unstructured way. It's not categorized at the source. So this is always piling up. You're always playing a catch-up game here. Spend data is extremely fragmented. There is no proper category coding. In many cases, there is missing information fields. Sometimes the item description is missing. Sometimes the item description is all you have. Now, to do spend analysis properly, it has to be both proactive and reactive. By proactive, I mean you have to be able to have a system which is capturing your spend data at the point which is generated and classifying it properly, so that you don't have to go through a subsequent cleansing and categorization exercise to get any meaningful data out of it. And reactive is obviously where you are doing a regular refresh, either at a monthly, quarterly, annually, or half-yearly level. But to practically achieve that also, you need to have a system of doing that classification of data. How do you do that? Do you have 10 guys sitting in a room manually putting each spend line item into the right category? Do you outsource that to a provider who claims to have AI, ML-based spend classification? How do you do it today? In many cases, you don't. And that is the reason why this data is left out of the analysis. So depending on the company's size and level of procurement process maturity, you have to take a first principles approach to this. And only with this strong foundation can higher order buzzwords such as ChatGPT, predictive analytics, spend forecasting, and these kind of things become feasible. Until then, they remain just buzzwords, curiosities, things that only multi-billion-dollar US and European companies can consider. Any thoughts, any questions from anyone on the team on the floor so far? All right, let me continue. Now, coming to sourcing. The buzzwords here are touchless sourcing, autonomous procurement, sustainable sourcing. These words have kind of permeated the zeitgeist of procurement. However, most of these are, again, far off virtual concepts that have zero practical application in the Indian context. Because, again, the infrastructure simply doesn't exist. To enable these kind of buzzwords in reality, you need prerequisites such as a modern, mature ecosystem where both buyers, suppliers, and the supporting technology already have a high degree of automation and maturity. So these buzzwords apply to the next evolution, building on an already strong baseline for even greater sourcing efficiency. But this baseline does not exist in India today. The vast majority of companies still have manual sourcing processes in place. By manual, I mean they're sending RFIs, RFPs, and RFQs to vendors over emails as an Excel spreadsheet. They're collecting responses over email. You're manually creating comparison tables. Now, most of these companies I'm talking about already have an ERP system. An ERP with a built-in module for RFQs and RFIs. But why are they still doing things manually over email, Excel, and phone calls? Because apart from some very core direct materials categories with your main strategic suppliers, the ERP sourcing interface is too clunky, unwieldy, and impractical for smaller spend band vendors to easily adopt and regularly use. And this is even with an ERP system with paid-for sourcing modules in place. So therefore, these modules are either not being used at all, or is just another process step which your buyers have to comply with because they're forced to. And in many cases, sorry, I'll forget this. Because they're forced to. And in many cases, they are manually entering vendor bids that they've received over email into the system just for comparative creation and process adherence. And even for the really high revenue bracket companies, now whether these are Indian enterprises who have deployed global sourcing platforms or Indian business units of large MNCs who have successful global deployments of e-sourcing technology. But even with companies like this who have the tools and the licenses available, they hit a brick wall when they come across the Indian vendor. So I can name at least 10 companies who I've spoken to who have global licenses with players like Ariba, Zycus, Coupa, you name it. But in India, they're still doing things over email and Excel. Why? Because a different approach is needed for tackling the Indian vendor mindset. I'll just close this for now. Coming to contract management. This, again, contract lifecycle management as we imagine it in articles by Zycus and Coupa and all the other biggest players in the market, where you've got an integrated CLM tool, where you've got a centralized clause library, you've got approval flows, both sequential and serial, you've got redlining happening with both the contract negotiators on your side and the vendors all working on a single platform all the way through contract signatures. Again, this does not happen here today. In many cases in India, we don't have a contract. The PO serves as the contract. So there's no contract lifecycle management process at all. At the most, you've got a contract repository tool, possibly, where it's basically just a massive data dump of all your contracts. Or it's just a SharePoint folder. Or even worse, D drive on Ankit's computer. Now, that is the base reality. So coming to things like advanced concepts such as contract risk management, contract performance tracking, contract utilization tracking. How will you do utilization tracking if you don't even have any spend to contract linkage? So again, this is the reality of the situation. This is not a good reality or a good baseline to be in. We need to grow beyond this. And to do that, we need technology. Again, briefly touching upon supplier management and intake processes. Intake is usually done maybe with an Excel template which somebody fills up, sends over email. That gets routed through, I don't know how many levels of approval before being finally sent to someone for execution. Now, this intake process, if you want to implement another tool for it, ultimately you're just putting in another solution which somebody has to adopt to, and it's just another process step for them to adhere to. There is no actual value add. And lastly, supplier management. This is something which is quite interesting because in India, we don't even think of supplier management beyond our core primary strategic suppliers. We don't do scorecarding for any vendors outside of that core supplier base or the strategic supplier base. Why is that? Because the effort required to actually regularly score and track your vendor performance versus the time and effort required is not relevant to the kind of value that that activity generates beyond that activity for the strategic suppliers. But in this day and age, at least with the current Indian ecosystem, with concepts like ESG and sustainability coming in, it becomes critical to incorporate a process where you are actually scoring your critical suppliers and even your tactical suppliers on their ESG compliance. You have this as a parameter in your vendor onboarding forms. You have this as a decision factor when considering vendor bids. And you also have to be able to even claim ESG credits. You have to be able to show that you're spending a certain amount with ESG-friendly vendors or ESG-compliant vendors. Again, that requires a core foundation of people, processes, and technology in order to achieve this at scale and really transform Indian procurement and sourcing. So what I've described so far are the buzzwords, which kind of mask the challenges. And now I'm going to come to the blueprint for achieving success. Having spoken personally to 500 to 1,000 companies across various sizes, from 500 crores to 5,000 crores to 50,000 crores, each one has different challenges or problems specific to their level. But if you look at a first principles approach, you all as procurement leaders here will be influencing and driving such transformation initiatives. So what we wanted to provide is a centralized blueprint which you can use to actually achieve success. What does this blueprint look like? We have a simple framework which is analyze, strategize, and execute. Come into analyze, where we just have to first figure out where we stand in terms of spend, suppliers, and stakeholders. Let's go into detail. First, when you analyze the spend, how do you analyze your spend data today? You would first have to categorize it, put it into the right bucket, ideally prevent new unclassified spend data from being created, while being able to rapidly classify the historical spend into the right buckets for analysis. Once you have done this, then you can actually figure out what are your enterprise-wide demand aggregation opportunities. Where can you rationalize the supply base? Where can you analyze purchase price variance, and by minimizing that price variance, you can get advantages? Where can you identify your maverick or your off-contract spending? By spend-to-contract matching, so that you can identify these areas of maverick or one-time spending and bring them under contract. So obviously, spend analysis, opportunity identification, and category profiling are the first step to a successful analytics or analyze exercise. Coming to stakeholders and suppliers. Obviously, any sort of project or procurement transformation initiative will require buy-in from the immediate procurement team who is used to doing something a certain way. To get through that traditional mindset and to bring them on board and to get that buy-in for any sort of successful procurement transformation requires smooth communication about the benefits, about the kind of upskilling that they will achieve, what impact that will have on their career, and how that will make their own profile and persona more valuable in the overall market. This is one of the key factors to getting any sort of procurement technology transformation project off the ground. Senior management. Many of you are senior managers today, so you will have to drive this yourselves. If you're not, and you find that you would want to bring this change in, you would need to secure buy-in from the senior management. So, making sure that the senior management is aligned and on board with what your potential vision for procurement transformation is another key factor. Next is the business. Procurement doesn't work in a silo. It's working with finance, it's working with engineering, it's working with production planning, it's working with departments across the board. So whatever activity or whatever technology procurement decides to adopt will have across the board impact on the broader organization. So sensitizing this, securing buy-in from cross-functional stakeholders is again where the value will come from. And last but definitely not the least is the vendors. If your vendors do not adopt whichever procurement technology you have made the decision to implement, then that is a failure from the get-go. Vendor adoption is the key. And how do you ensure vendor adoption? By giving them another complex tool which they have to comply with, another complex form which they have to fill up for the privilege of doing business with you. Unless you give them something that's easier than just attaching an Excel file to a WhatsApp message and sending it to you, until you have something easier than that, don't try automating anything. And so that comes to the stakeholders. Lastly is your solution stack. You have to figure out where you are today. So this differs for various companies. If you're a small company, you're probably doing everything for the first time. So now is a good time to invest in procurement technology. If you're a mid-sized company who's had experiments with this in the past, you need to figure out why those experiments did not work out the way you wanted to, and what are your expectations and plan for making sure this does not happen again. And if you're a mature organization, you need to figure out what strategy aligns with your current solution set and how you can migrate from that solution set in an incremental way to a final best case scenario. The second part is strategizing. How do you strategize your procurement transformation approach? So I have one question for all of the procurement leaders here today. How many of you know what your PR to PO cycle time is today? Show of hands, please. So that's less than 5% of people. This is a key metric to understand whether procurement is working efficiently or whether it's lagging. If procurement is the bottleneck in your production process, then you'll never be able to have competitive advantage as compared to your competitors. How much capital gets blocked to this extended PR to PO lead time? What is the current level of procurement compliance? Where are the PRs getting stuck? Do you have visibility into that? What are the reasons for the PRs getting stuck? Do you have visibility into that? How long does it take you to get accurate spend data? First, you need to assess all of these questions figure out what your what your distance to the best practice is, and then take appropriate action to get from point A to point B. And lastly, aiming for profits. Lastly is the methodology. Now, there are a lot of strategies involved, such as volume of expenditure, total cost of ownership analysis, umpteen the procurement strategies that you can use, but ultimately you have to execute these strategies to get the ultimate value. This strategy execution will, again, not just happen with process. It has to be supported by the correct technology, which connects all of these people, processes, and stakeholders together into an efficient engine that is sourcing for the future. That's pretty much it from my side. I would like to open the floor to any questions now. Yeah. Questions?
Audible. So yes, Gaurav, your points are well valid, but you told one thing, the first slide you spoke about the span analysis. So as a group, we are doing internally at our organizations, and we are also defining the category-wise span analysis, because this is the first things what the supply chain is doing at the initial stage of life. But what is your criteria? What are you thinking about that? How could you spend category-wise, not even in the group, but you can pan India or the internationally, you can club all the data together and then discuss in the pan on the single platform with your client, if you can do that. So is that your thinking level for the next upcoming through from the Procol, or what is something else you want to discuss with us?
So in terms of spend analysis, in order to get a global consolidated view, you would first have to collect extracts from each of the different divisions. Then you have to see what is the missing data in each of these extracts. Ideally, each extract then has to be consolidated into a single data set with at least some common criteria across all of the board. And where enrichment is required, either manual enrichment through a services company or AI-based technology-powered enrichment through another product company, you can use that to get a consolidated, categorized, enriched view of enterprise-wide global spending, because only once you have enterprise-wide visibility will you be able to aggregate demand at an enterprise level. Otherwise, you'll be restricted to aggregating demand at a category or a business unit or a country level. So that is the first step, and this is something that Procol does. We help with companies with consolidating all of their spend data so that at least certain categories can be identified, which can then be easily strategically sourced via our e-sourcing platform.
But Gaurav, there is conflict in that, because when you are going to make a tie-up with any of your client, you have to make an NDA that you are not going to open their data with respect to the other organization in the Pan India or the other common platform. So how you are mitigating that risk with each and other organization?
So in that, there would have to be a data sharing agreement in place in order to achieve that. Correct. That we have to incorporate into the contract itself.
How you are sharing that message with other company? So that, because each and every organization have their own spend analysis at their level. How you will give the special services from Procol end so that they could understand that this price is might be some reduction in that price, and might be the delivery timeline could be reduced with respect to the market.
So you're talking about price benchmarking potentially, right?
Benchmarking with respect to other.
Price benchmarking becomes tricky because you have to either provide something which is completely unrelated to the customer data that you're processing, because then there is a risk that your customers will get afraid that you're using their data for marketing purposes. So that becomes tricky, and most companies who do that will have a separate survey mechanism of collecting these prices from market indices or from local vendors and contacts like that, and creating their own customized index, which they would then share with the client. But to use client data to figure out, okay, out of my 100 customers, 20 of them are buying printer cartridges at this price. Again, that would be a breach of confidentiality. So I would love to speak to you about this personally, and we go into depth.
Perfect. Then your specialization comes in.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, please.
Thank you. Yeah, hi Gaurav. So this is Gaurav Sharma from GSK.
Pleasure.
Yeah, so one point where already we are ahead of the curve or at par from the market, like having all the data management, all accuracy, Power BI, Ariba, everything is in place. So what is your recommendation for those companies? Already we have the global ways of working, already cascading effect is there. So what is...
So if you're already at a maturity level where, say, at least 80% spend under management, you already have. You already have either a procurement suite, which is managing all the source to pay functions, or even you have integrated point modules, because ultimately if each of those have some API integration to each other and also feed into the core ERP system, you're pretty much good to go. For companies like you, those buzzwords actually make sense, where you're talking about ChatGPT based analytics, right? So you should, if rather than having your people put in the effort of manually going into this Power BI, configuring a report, you should be able to tell ChatGPT, pull out a report showing me my spending in these top 5 categories. That is something Procol can do today. So for the higher order companies which have higher maturity level, we are doing things like ChatGPT based analytics. We are doing things like analyzing a supplier who's participating in your RFQs and auctions over a period of time, using AI to analyze that, okay, for a particular supplier, based on his past bidding platform, I know I have an additional 2% margin here that I can push him to, because historically he has made this concession in the past. That's one area.
Got it, got it. So it means basically suiting to your business, maybe
Yes.
if you say, I think finding the blind spot,
Yes.
and SWOT analysis and local to local, more
Yes.
can be done. Okay. Thanks, Gaurav.
Perfect. Any other questions from the team? Perfect. If there are no other questions, I think we can conclude. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing your observations, sir. And now I would request Ms. Seema Mohante, Global Supplier Manager, Fungicide, Bayer Crop Science Limited, to kindly join us on stage and felicitate